Hey y'all, this is the last video on the module for chapter 22, the heart. I just have these notes pulled up, so I'm not on webcam because I'm a hot mess right now, so bear with me. But this last section is going to be from chapter 22.4, I believe it is, and here's the section in your notes. It's the conducting system and innervation of the heart. So we're going to talk about how the heart beats and how the muscles in the heart wall generate that, that electricity in order to contract muscle cells. So it's part G in your lecture notes right here. And then we're going to skip autonomic motor innervation, or I think that is section 22.5. So we're not going to talk about autonomic innervation just because we are trying to keep things as simple as possible. And also you will learn all about autonomic innervation of the heart in physiology. Okay, so something to look forward to. So just briefly, here we go. The heart's conducting system. The heart has what's called an intrinsic conducting system, which means that it initiates its own heartbeats. So it's not that it receives this constant input every time your heart beats. Does not mean that it's receiving input from an external nervous innervation. It has its own innervation, its own rhythmicity. And you'll learn all about that in physiology and what characteristics of these specialized cells that allow them to keep beating, right? To keep producing electrical activity. So the feature or the characteristic of the heart that's really, really cool is autorhythmicity, and that's what allows it to initiate its own heartbeats. Okay, the system that we're going to talk about, the conducting system, okay, it's also referred to as the intrinsic conducting system. It consists of these specialized cells that start and propagate electrical impulses to the contractile cells. So we're just going to talk about the groups of specialized cells that propagate these electrical impulses to allow heart muscle to contract. And all you need to know is the pathway. Okay, so if we look here, we're going to start here in the sinoatrial node. Okay, and that is also referred to as a pacemaker. If you've ever heard of anyone with a pacemaker, it means that they have some kind of dysfunction or pathology with their intrinsic pacemaker. So the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, is located on the superior posterior wall of the right atrium. It generates an electrical impulse. It is the one that starts, and then that electrical impulse travels through the walls of the atrium to the AV node, okay, the atrioventricular node. Okay, that's the second path. And then also this SA node, those impulses spread through the left atrium. So if you think about it, now that we have propagated an electrical impulse through the walls of the atria, that should tell you something about how the heart contracts. Okay, so the atria are going to contract first, and then the electrical impulse spreads to the atrioventricular node, which sits in between the atria and the ventricles. And then the next part in the pathway is called the AV bundle, or the bundle of His. Okay, so this is the bundle of His right here. And then the electrical impulse is then going to travel. It's going to bifurcate. The bundle of His bifurcates into the right and left bundles or right and left bundle branches. And then it goes through these fibers. It gets highly, highly branched into these fibers called Purkinje fibers. So we go from the AV node to the AV bundle or bundle of His, and then right and left bundle branches. I'm just going to leave right and left so you know it's oopsies. All right, deleted that. All right, so 1 is our sinoatrial node. 2 is our AV node. 3 is our AV bundle right here, our bundle. Can you identify what structure that bundle of His is located in? You should be able to identify that structure. So that is basically the wall that sits in between the ventricles. That is the interventricular septum. And then it bifurcates into the right and left bundle branches, or right and left bundles. Bam. And then you have a lot more branching here in the Purkinje fibers. Okay, 1, 2, 3, no. 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that is the conduction system of the heart, the intrinsic conducting system of the heart. You have the specialized cells. There are your words that you can study from. And these are the events associated with it, right? So first we have the muscle impulse is generated in the SA node. It spreads throughout the atria. Okay, that means the atria are going to contract before the ventricles, and then the AV node via the internodal pathways. So from node to node, we're going through internodal pathways. And what you see here in green, you can see this green color kind of spreading through the atria. That means that the electrical impulse has now spread through the atrial walls. Then you have the AV node cells slightly delay. This is really, really, really important. There is a slight delay to the muscle impulse as it travels to the AV bundle. And why would you have something like that? Why would you need a delay from traveling from the atria to the ventricles? Okay, it's because you want the atria to completely contract and send all of the blood out into the ventricles so you can make sure all the blood has been passed to the ventricles and you have complete emptying of the atria before you contract the ventricles, right? So that delay is really important. And now you have that impulse. You see this green color over here. You have the impulse spreading into the interventricular septum. So first it goes through the AV bundle, the bundle of His, into the interventricular septum, and now it starts to spread through the interventricular septum, and then it splits off into the right and left bundle branches. And now that it goes through the Purkinje fibers, you see this green color spreading up through the ventricles. So that also tells you how that impulse travels through the walls of the ventricles. It starts from the apex of the heart. It travels down to the apex, and then it travels back up through the walls of the ventricles and throughout the ventricular myocardium, and then the ventricles contract from the bottom up. And that is going to ensure that you pump all of the blood out from the ventricles into the greater vessels that they are going into. Okay, so what I want you to know for this is the pathway, and then if we look at an electrocardiogram or EKG, or now it's called an ECG. I know we have some people in the class who look at these all day long, so some of you have been seeing these before. The electrocardiogram tells us about the events that are happening in the heart relative to the intrinsic conduction system. So here, if we look at this graph, what we're looking at, this is kind of like your classical ticker tape. Back in the day, ECGs actually used to print out on ticker tape that looks like this, and doctors and medical professionals would be able to look at it because they can see what's going on within a certain time. Right, so here what we're looking at is millivolts. We're looking at potential over time. All right, and what this is telling you is there are a few events. So we have number one is the P wave. The P wave has to do with atrial depolarization. So depolarization, we see a rise in the potential, or it's going from a more negative to a more positive voltage. That is your P wave, followed by what's called the QRS complex. The QRS complex is this huge event that corresponds to ventricular depolarization. So ventricular depolarization and atrial repolarization are happening at the same time, but you cannot see atrial repolarization because of this huge event of ventricular depolarization, and that is the QRS complex. And then last but not least, we have the T wave, which has to do with ventricular repolarization. So this corresponds to the electric conducting system of the heart. We're not going to go into too much detail. I just want to introduce you to the basics. These EKGs can tell us a lot about different pathologies associated with heartbeat. They can also tell us things about speed, like we have tachycardia and bradycardia are two descriptions of the speed. So tachycardia is a very fast heart rate, whereas bradycardia is a very slow heart rate. So it tells us about the what the heart is doing. Okay, so just the basics on the electrocardiogram. And then blood flow through the heart. So by the end of this lesson, hopefully, as we look through the anatomy, you should be able to now trace blood flow through the heart. So in the first video, we looked at an overview of the cardiovascular system and basic blood flow to and from the heart. Now that we've learned some of the structures in the internal anatomy of the heart, you should be able to identify and follow blood flow through the heart. This is very, 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 very important. You need to know this. Okay, so as we did in the first overview, I'm going to start right here, just because we started in the right atrium. We go from the right atrium, we're eventually going to the right ventricle, but we pass through the right AV valve. So your book is keeping it pretty simple in calling them the right AV and the left AV valve. Your right AV valve is your tricuspid valve. Okay, so you have the right AV valve, the blood passes through that valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, once the right ventricle contracts, we're going to, so if you think about it, on the right side of the heart, we are pumping deoxygenated blood. Okay, so that means it's going to go to the pulmonary arteries. So at the base of the pulmonary arteries, you have the pulmonary semilunar valve. Then you go into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, and you're eventually going to the lungs, right? Because you see the word pulmonary here, you have deoxygenated blood that needs to get sent back to the lungs to pick up oxygen. And now we go to veins that are carrying oxygenated blood back to the heart. Those are your pulmonary veins. And it's going to go to the left atrium. From the left atrium, we pass through our left or bicuspid or mitral valve. Okay, you should know these terms. Left AV valve or bicuspid valve. And then it goes into the left Ventricle. From the left ventricle, we're going to pump oxygen-rich blood to the whole body, right? So we go through the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta. From the aorta, what we'll discuss in chapter 23 is blood flow to all the different tissues. So we're going to do blood traces and follow how we get to systemic arteries and then into tissues. That's where gas exchange happens in capillary beds and tissues. Now that it's dropped off its oxygen and picked up carbon dioxide, it's going to go back into systemic veins and back to the right side of the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava. There is also another source of deoxygenated blood coming from the heart itself. Can you remember what it is? It is the coronary sinus. Okay, so we're just keeping it simple, just the basics for the rest of the semester. Okay, so blood flow through the heart and the intrinsic conduction system. We are not going to discuss autonomic innervation, and we are not going to discuss the cardiac cycle, because I don't want to throw a whole bunch of information at you guys that you will be learning during physiology next semester anyway. So that is our last video for chapter 22, the heart.